Finally, after 3 hours and 14 minutes, Gray asked him the one question, the only question he really cared about. Was the pathogen that you found in the tick that Alan Steer, the Lyme outbreak investigator, gave you the same pathogen or similar or a generational mutation of the one you published in the paper from 1952? In response, Willie crossed his arms defensively, took a deep breath, and stared into the camera for 43 seconds, an eternity. Then he looked away, down and to the right, and he appeared to be working through an internal debate. The left side of his mouth briefly curled up, as if he's thinking, oh well. Then anger flashes across his face. Yeah, he says more in German than English. It was a stunning admission from one of the world's foremost authorities on Lyme disease. If it was true, it meant that Willie had left out essential data from his scientific articles on the Lyme disease outbreak, and that as the disease spread like a wildfire in the Northeast and Great Lakes regions of the United States, he was part of the cover-up of the truth. He seemed to be saying that Lyme wasn't a naturally occurring germ, one that may have gotten loose and been spread by global warming, an explosion of deer, or other environmental factor changes. It had been created in a military bioweapons lab for the specific purpose of harming human beings. And somehow it had gotten out. What you just heard was a quote from the book Bitten by Chris Newby on the secret history of Lyme disease and biological weapons. Welcome to Tech Post. I'm your host, Trent Lipinski. And in this episode, I'm going to actually do a book review. I've never done this before, so please bear with me, but I'm reviewing the book Bitten. Bitten was recently released. It's a new book by Chris Newby. It's about the secret history of Lyme disease and biological weapons. In this episode, I'm going to dive into the book Bitten, as well as talk a bit about Lyme disease and discuss whether or not it is a biological weapon designed by the US government. Please stay tuned. So I just finished reading the book Bitten by Chris Newby, and it's a fascinating read, because what Chris did is she obtained all of the letters and research from the guy who created Lyme disease. So people are going to be like, wait, some guy created Lyme disease? And yeah, someone created Lyme disease. Lyme disease, as revealed in this book, was actually created by the US government during the Cold War as part of a biological weapons research program. The person for which the disease is actually named after is actually a guy who created it, or at least his research helped lead to creating it. And they ended up naming the disease after him, but he confessed about, a year or two before he passed away, and confessed that he was part of a biological weapons research program and that his research was used in the development of Lyme disease. It's a really scary thing, because what this means is the disease that personally I have and that's impacted my life significantly is actually a bioweapon. This was created by the US government during this Cold War, weapons research. And this book goes into a lot of details about, what happened, how they created the disease, how they were experimenting with these things, why they were experimenting with them. And it's just a fascinating read. As an author, Chris did an excellent job of writing this in a digestible way. So what she really did is she profiled the guy who created Lyme disease. How Lyme disease was created and how this research was conducted is they would take bacteria and viruses that they had collected from around the world, as well as ticks from around the world, and then they would put these viruses in bacteria and infect the bacteria with these viruses, knowing that if you infected bacteria with viruses, it could change the gene expression of those bacteria, then feed the infected bacteria to a tick and see if it would either kill the tick or what effect it would have on the tick. And they were then putting multiple diseases, viruses, and bacteria inside these ticks and letting them breed within the tick's stomach. So again, this was the 1950s and 60s, so they didn't have CRISPR, they didn't have gene editing, they didn't have the techniques and the science that we have today. So they literally had to breed diseases for these purposes back then, much like you would breed dogs or cattle or whatever. They essentially were just doing it on a biological level. They would then take the bacteria and the viruses that had been fed to these ticks and allowed those to breed inside the tick's stomach. They would then take the tick and place it on a rabbit and see what effect the diseases would have on the rabbit. So these diseases range from rickettsia, babesia, the spirochete that causes Lyme disease is potentially a combination of all of these different diseases. So it's got some DNA potentially from rickettsia. It has some DNA potentially from babesia. Has some DNA potentially from Bartonella. It has DNA potentially from all these different viruses and all these different bacterium and all these different spirochetes that were put inside these ticks to breed this new disease. So this book is particularly interesting to me personally because I actually have Lyme disease. I've tested positive for it, and I've been battling this disease for quite a while. It's pretty horrible and it's pretty screwed up, and I've talked to a number of scientists and doctors myself, and I've done a ton of research on it, and unfortunately, all the doctors and scientists that I've spoken to have also concluded that they believe that Lyme disease is a genetically modified organism. So what this means is that at some point it was genetically modified or bred to be able to have certain characteristics. For example, the characteristics that enable it to evade the immune system, or the characteristics that enable it to evade antibiotic treatment. This is one of those things that we just don't have a lot of information about because, unfortunately, if this is true, then that explains why there's no clear diagnostic criteria. That explains why the CDC criteria is complete nonsense. It's not scientific. It's junk. Most of the people who get tested using the CDC criteria will test negative and get negative results, even though something like 40, 50, 60% of them sometimes actually have Lyme disease. So if you follow the CDC criteria, there is a significant chance that you're going to get an inaccurate diagnosis and you're going to be told that you're negative when you're actually positive. So you have to actually go to a different lab, typically a lab outside the medical system. I personally had to do this. I worked with a lab called IGenix in Palo Alto, and they were able to test me for antibody bands, which the CDC has excluded from their testing criteria. I tested positive, of course, for one of these bands. It's antibody band 31, OPSA A. And then there's band 34, which is OPSA B, which both of these are outer surface proteins. So what this means is they're proteins that are on the outer surface of the bacteria. And these outer surface proteins have been excluded from the vast majority, probably 98, 99% of the tests and the labs that most doctors use. So if you go to your standard medical doctor, if you go to an MD and you get tested for Lyme disease, they are not looking at these two outer surface proteins. So what that means is you're going to get a more inaccurate diagnosis, which is what is happening to a lot of people. So it's pretty screwed up because if you do test for these other antibody bands, you can get a more accurate diagnosis and you can figure out whether or not you have Lyme disease more accurately. The reason they were excluded is because members of the CDC were involved in a vaccine called the Lymerix vaccine, and they were basically trying to make sure that people who had been vaccinated didn't test positive for Lyme. So they changed the diagnostic criteria for how you diagnose and how you test for Lyme disease so that people wouldn't test positive for the vaccine. Unfortunately, the vaccine had to be pulled from the market because it was giving people Lyme disease. Many of the people who received the vaccine had the same symptom profile as Lyme disease and became chronically ill. It is suspected that these outer surface proteins still contain some of the genetic material to be able to create persister cells. We don't really know what happened, but that's one theory. And Either way, the vaccine was pulled. They were sued by hundreds of patients. They had to remove the vaccine from the market. And a lot of the people who were vaccinated could still get Lyme disease. And then many of the people who received the vaccine started getting Lyme disease symptoms. And hundreds of them banded together in a class action lawsuit and sued the vaccine maker to pull the vaccine from the market. So this vaccine was not safe. It was rushed to the market, and it didn't work. So they had to pull it. Millions of people received that vaccine, and hundreds, if not thousands of them actually got Lyme disease symptoms from the vaccine. So there's a lot of controversy with how the diagnostic criteria works with this disease, unfortunately, and there's a lot of unknowns and a lot of variables. So then what we didn't know is where this disease came from, because this disease is closely related to syphilis. Like if you were to pick a cousin of, another similar disease, like the closest thing that exists to Lyme disease and the Lyme disease spirochete is syphilis. But syphilis only has like a couple dozen genes, and Lyme disease has well over 100. So the genetic profile of the Lyme disease spirochete bacteria is completely different than its closest cousin. So it has almost 4 or 5 times the genetic information available to it to be able to change its shape, to go into different phases of the disease, to go into remission, to be able to avoid the immune system. It has the capability to produce what's called a biofilm. A biofilm is essentially like this filmy layer that bacteria creates. And the Lyme disease biofilms that are formed, what it does is it pulls minerals out of the body, and it creates this film to kind of protect itself from the immune system so that it can go into hiding. So when you take antibiotics and you've got Lyme disease, what will happen is the Lyme disease will start to form these biofilms and hide and encode itself in the minerals that it's leached from your blood, and basically create a protective layer around itself and go into remission. So it'll wait until you've stopped taking the antibiotics for it to then come out of remission and reinfect you all over again. This is why this disease is so hard and difficult to treat once it goes into its chronic state. And honestly, I'm not even sure that people who get antibiotics when they first get infected can actually even really overcome this. The percentages and some of the information available seems to indicate that, yeah, if you get antibiotics early enough, you might be able to overcome the disease. But most of the people that I've talked to that caught it early still went chronic. So there's a lot of things we just don't know about this disease, and the possibility that it's a bioweapon means that the government possibly does know and simply has not declassified this information, which means it's very realistic that the US government knows what Lyme disease is, knows how it got released, and won't tell us. We don't actually know how Lyme disease escaped the lab, or if it escaped the lab. In fact, in the book Bitten, she brings up the possibility that the guy who discovered Lyme disease may have also had a hand in it being released. There are several instances where he reported to others that the Russians had stolen his research. There was some instances where some federal agents had visited him and asked him about missing items from his lab, including biological agents potentially. There is also some money that he came into, which was put into a Swiss bank account, which we don't know where it was from or if it had anything to do with any of this. There's a number of questions. So there's a new theory proposed in this book that Lyme disease was actually stolen by the Russian government because they got a hold of the US research on tick-borne illnesses and then actually released it in the United States as a biological weapons attack against the United States of America. So this theory doesn't have a lot of evidence, but there is some evidence to suggest it is a possibility that is on the table. So there is a possibility that Lyme disease was actually released in the United States by the Russian government to try and attack the United States of America. So some people are probably wondering, like, why would they do this? Well, they literally designed these spirochetes and these diseases to maim the population, not to completely kill the population, but to weaken them so that an invading force could pretty much just march in and their medical system would be overburdened. They would be taking care of all the people who are sick. The disease would be contagious. Number of people would be getting it. The idea was if you could weaken your enemy just enough that you could use these diseases to essentially just walk in and take over their country. That was the core concept that the CIA and the government was working off of when they were developing these biological weapon research programs. So it is completely within the realm of possibility that a foreign government such as the Russian government did get their hands on biological agents, was able to reproduce some of this research, and then infected the United States of America as an attack. That is just one theory and one possibility. Another possibility is it simply escaped the lab. I mean, Plum Island is still a significant possibility in theory. There is a FDA research facility off the coast of Lyme, Connecticut, for which the disease is named after. And it was, it was known that they were doing tick research there. They were probably working with some of the research from the guy who discovered Lyme disease. And it's a real possibility that it escaped the lab there by accident. And then there's a third possibility that it was actually released by the US government by design to infect the US population. Some people might be wondering, why the US government might infect its own population. Well, it's the same thing as other diseases. Unfortunately, there's money to be made in treating people who are sick. We have a pharmaceutical industry in this country that benefits from providing people with long-term solutions to problems rather than cures. So there is a possibility that the government had a hand in this in one way or another. We now know for a fact that it was developed in a lab. It was part of this research. We just don't know how it actually escaped the lab. And there were critical components of the research that were also left out of the final reports. And some of those documents were actually recovered in this book, Bitten, and revealed for the first time. So she actually found documents that had never been before released. She had to do Freedom of Information Act requests, and then also had to locate missing files and documents that weren't available to her from the US government. So she's put together a profile here of the situation and collected data that we didn't have before. What it tells us is Lyme disease is a result of biological weapons research, and we just don't know how it escaped the lab. And there may be other causative agents, such as this Swiss agent, which has been renamed to Rickettsia helvetica, that may also play a factor. So the biggest thing that people need to understand is Lyme disease is not a single bacteria. It is not a single infection. The term Lyme disease, really what it truly means is it's a polymicrobial infection. What that means is there's multiple agents that cause disease. So there's viruses, there's bacterial components, and there's multiple co-infections. So co-infections are these components within these polymicrobial infections. So they're Babesia, they're these other co-infectants, they're Bartonella, they're these other diseases, these other viruses, Rickettsia, that also get transmitted when you get bitten by these ticks. There really is no such thing as a clean tick. Any tick that bites you is going to transmit bacteria and viruses. Not all ticks contain Lyme disease, but every tick out there contains bacteria and viruses. If you get bit by a tick, had some kind of disease transmitted to you, whether it was a virus, whether it was a bacteria, whether it was the spirochete that causes Lyme disease, or Rickettsia helvetica, or some of these other agents, it's unknown. You have to collect the tick and save it, and you can actually get them tested themselves, which is actually the most effective way of finding out what is inside these bloodsuckers. But you can also then, there's a number of tests that you can also do, but some of these can't even be tested for, and we don't have clear tests. And as I discussed earlier, diagnostic criteria that the CDC has is total BS. So there's no better way to test for these diseases than to test the ticks themselves. And even so, there may be something in there that we don't know what it is. So, and we don't know what we're looking for. So Unfortunately, if you get bitten by a tick, your best course of action is to take doxycycline or some other kind of antibiotics or antimicrobial drugs or herbs, because you've been infected with something. You might not get Lyme disease from it necessarily, but you've been infected with a bacteria or virus or both or several infections or co-infections. So unfortunately, the tick population in the United States is completely infected, and this has become a worldwide epidemic. I've literally spoken with a veterinarian online who was testing animals down in South America, and 90% of the animals he tested, over 500 animals tested, over 90% of them tested positive for Lyme disease. So this is affecting our pets, this is potentially affecting our food supply, and this is affecting people all over the world. There are cases in China, there are cases in Russia, there are cases in Canada, there are cases in Europe, and there are different versions of these spirochetes, and there are different co-infections that come with these infections, and they are all present as well. So this is also a further indication that human hands have meddled in the Lyme disease crisis, and this is not just something that's happening organically. Humans are to blame for this, and unfortunately, we now know that a lot of this is the result of the US government's biological weapons research, and Lyme disease is not what we thought it was. It is probably one of the world's first genetically modified organisms that was purposely bred to be untreatable. And it has now become an epidemic in this country. Please let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. I know this is a bit of controversy, but this is coming from a Stanford Medical research writer and documentary film creator. That is the person who wrote this book. It is not coming from some conspiracy theorist or something like that. This is coming from someone who did the research, who has the research to prove everything that I've just been talking about, and wrote this book and published it. I mean, potentially at the risk of her own life. Publishing information like this, you know, we've seen what happens to whistleblowers. She risked her life publishing this information, and, you know, she herself has Lyme disease. Her husband has it as well. And this is, you know, this is what we're dealing with here. This is something that we've never dealt with before. And unfortunately, you know, the US government is potentially responsible. And personally, I think that they need to declassify everything they have on this disease, and they need to declassify any and all research related to this disease, including potential treatments and any other information that they might have, because that information could be critical to curing people like me and curing people like Chris Newby, who wrote this book. So please, you know, investigate this for yourself. You can go pick up a copy of the book. It's on Amazon. It's a great read. It's written in a way where it almost reads like a spy thriller. It's kind of like a Cold War style spy thriller. And then she reveals a lot of the information kind of towards the end of the book. Obviously, there's plenty of spoilers here, and I've given up some of the best parts. But at the same time, it doesn't take away from the art of the book and how she wrote it. And I highly, highly recommend it, even if you don't have Lyme disease. It is a fantastic read, and it just speaks to the true nature of how the US government works, how the deep state operates, and the real world that we are living in. Right now, coming to you, speaking this podcast, I have a biological weapon inside of me that's been making me sick most of my life. That is reality. That is what's happening here. And it is really important that we face this reality for what it is. Thanks for watching another uncensored episode of TechPost.io. I'm your host, Trent Lipinski, and don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube and hit that little notification bell next to the subscribe button so that you can get notified when we release new episodes. You can also find us on iTunes, Google Play, and other social networks, including Twitter and Facebook, at TechPost.io, and you can find me personally at Trent Lipinski. Once again, I'm Trent Lipinski, and this has been another great episode of TechPost.io. We'll see you soon.